Now, can you guess which phone took the sharpest image? It's on the ultra-wide-angle lens. As far as I can tell, the one on the second right is the sharpest, and is taken with the Xperia 1 Mark 7. So now the ultra-wide-angle lens on this phone is clearly sharper than the rest of the competition, not only in the center of the frame, but also the edges. Alright, super long-range telephoto photography is also going to be covered in this video, so stay tuned. Alright, this video you're watching right now is filmed entirely on a Sony Xperia 1 Mark 7. I mean, with minimal aid of only a tripod and a wireless microphone. So all the camera movement you're seeing right now is done internally on the 1 Mark 7 itself. The biggest or the only major change on the outside could be the iconic sophisticated purple color on a Sony phone. Now, internally you have all this sort of Xperia intelligent stuff going on, as well as a much upgraded 1/1.56-inch ultra-wide-angle lens, the Snapdragon 8 Elite chip, and a brighter display, so now it's comparable to the Samsung S25 Ultra actually. Now, with all the AI extra stuff and the upgraded ultra-wide camera, the only question we've got here is, how does it actually compare to the rest of the flagship lineup? So to start off with, we have the design and the aesthetics. Alright, the moment you're looking at this phone, you're holding it, touching it, you will notice it is a phone from Sony. You've got all the essence of it, no question about it. By saying so, we still have a 2 stages camera shutter key. The 3.5mm headphone jack with upgraded Walkman technology here this year, this pair of front-facing speakers, the side-mounted power button doubling as a fingerprint sensor, microSD card slot is here as well, and you're right, the bezel is still here as well. It's 2025, I know, every year since the iPhone 10. The problem we've got at the moment is we can't actually have an under-display camera with no sacrifice on the video or the picture quality. And we do need that once in a while for video conference, aren't we? Despite me, myself, rarely, maybe even never use that front-facing selfie camera, I'll just use the ultra-wide-angle lens for similar framing ultra-wide portrait. But it seems to me that Sony is currently prioritizing 1. A seamless display with no notch or no camera cutout, 2. A full-functioning, full-quality selfie camera not compromised, 3. Dual front-facing speakers over a stunning-looking, almost no-bezel full-screen design. Now, if you look at the competition, it may now all make sense. The 1 Mark 7 is now the only flagship which features a dual front-facing speaker setup, SD card slot, 3.5mm headphone jack, and it's actually the only phone we've got here that weighs under 200 grams at 197 grams. So it's going to be around 30 grams lighter than the iPhone 16 Pro Max, which weighs at 227 grams. Similar weights for the Xiaomi 15 Ultra and 218 grams for the S25 Ultra. So on one hand you have the lightest phone with the most features, and on the other hand you have the most bezel. So at the end I think it all comes to preference. Alright, speaking of preference, we have the largest display here on the iPhone and the Samsung at 6.9 inches, 6.73 inches on the Xiaomi, and finally we are dealing with a smaller display, 6.5 inches on the Sony Xperia 1 Mark 7. So it's also going to be a slimmer, maybe narrower phone compared to the other 3, which means better one-hand grip. And the last thing about the design is both Samsung and Xiaomi is utilizing a under-display ultrasonic fingerprint sensor, a side-mounted sensor on the Sony, and Face ID on the iPhone. And last but not least, we have IP68 water industry resistance on all 4 phones. Alright, back to the auto framing feature. You might have seen similar stuff on the recent Samsung flagships. But this video you're seeing here is also shot on the Sony Xperia 1 Mark 7. So it now simultaneously gives us a vertical 16:9, 9:16 video alongside with a 16:9 original backup video. You might be thinking it's a digital cropped video. The resolution and the clarity is never going to be the same as the original one. You know, you're right. But who is going to care on Instagram or TikTok? And here's another catch, it actually supports the ultra-wide-angle lens alongside with the main camera, and the implementation of these features actually shockingly similar to the one I've seen on the Sony ZV-E1, another Sony Alpha camera which focuses on video capabilities. You can actually manually select how much you want to crop in, and it also offers the flexibility to choose between cropping a horizontal video into a vertical 9:16 one, or maybe cropping a vertical one to a horizontal one. Alright, this video you're seeing here, on the Sony I've chosen a tighter framing auto tracking, and on the Samsung everything's automatic. So at the end, we're going to get a tighter framing on the Sony with more me and less the scenery. while on the Samsung, we have a full body shot. We are not getting this feature at the moment on the other two. Alright, this new feature on the Xperia 1 Mark 7 is actually quite interesting. It's now not only keeping me in the middle of the frame, but also stabilizing the video. So you've all seen Super Steady Mode, Sport Mode, Ultra Steady Mode on whatever they call on the iPhone, Samsung, and here on the Sony they call it AI camera work. But in fact, they do offer another layer of auto-tracking, auto-framing feature on top of the Super Steady Mode. The auto-framing here is not as active on the actual auto-framing mode, but similar tech is implemented here as well. So the video output is both digitally stabilized and keeping the subject you're intending to track in the middle of a frame, up to a certain degree. While the large sensor ultra-wide-angle lens now come into play a crucial part while dealing with all these AI features. Despite the Sony does shoot at 1080p under AI camera work, while the other three all are shooting at 2.8K or at least at 2K, the sharpness and the clarity of the video in the real world is actually higher on the Sony than the other three. So in my opinion, in the real world, this ultra-high quality ultra-wide-angle lens does help all this AI mode. Right, here's the other major upgrade this year on the Sony phone. So the 1 Mark 7 now supports all 4 of the focal lengths on the bokeh mode, which is Sony's portrait mode. While the true upgrade is that it's now got HDR support. Edge detection for the subject and the rendering of the photo is now much better, flagship tier I mean. While on the Xiaomi, all 4 of their cameras supports portrait photos. And today we'll be using Master Portrait for the comparison due to the sharper colors and more similar rendering to the other 3. While it can actually take photos with a sort of Leica look, with the Leica Portrait and Leica Authentic mode. Just keep that in mind. Alright, so which companies nailed portrait photography and delivers the most accurate edge detection? We'll be comparing each of the cameras and all the focal lengths. Here's the good news, all 4 of the phones we've got here today have nailed portrait mode rendering. Just look at how accurate my hair and the glasses transition from my head to the background. And it's already one of the hardest or challenging scenes I can get. Alright, the second scene we're going to see here, I was facing indoor, the dark side of the photo, and the background was actually a bright sunny day. So another good news we've got here is that even the Sony phone now supports HDR on the portrait bokeh mode, and all 4 of them nailed HDR on the portrait mode. The only difference you might see could be the rendering of the bokeh. As you can see on the Sony 1 Mark 7, even under broad daylight during the sun, it actually turned the highlight into this sort of creamy bokeh balls effect. What about another popular focal length for portrait photography? Around 50mm. Right, all 4 of these phones were zooming in from the main camera without losing any detail thanks to the high-resolution main camera. We have 48 on the iPhone, the Sony, 50 on the Xiaomi, and 200 on the S25 Ultra. Right, so the main difference here we've got is how they actually render the texture on the skin, while edge detection and the accuracy of the hair and the glasses are more or less the same across the board. So here's the conclusion I can draw using the portrait mode across all these phones. On the Sony, I've left skin softening effect on, while on the Xiaomi, Master Portrait was used on this test. So both the Xiaomi and the Sony was actively smoothing my skin, while on the Sony, we've got that sort of Japanese film camera touch to its photo, namely the white balance of its photo is more bluish and greenish. While on the S25 Ultra, you'll be still getting skin softening effect up to a certain level, so I would say the iPhone takes the most accurate and natural photo. But in my opinion, I do prefer the bokeh effect on the Sony. Right now we've come to 85 or 75mm, around 3 times zoom, which the iPhone is missing. On the Xiaomi 15 Ultra, we have a dedicated 3 times zoom camera for portrait photos, which is also 50 megapixels, not bad at all. Now on the Samsung S25 Ultra, we have a 10 megapixels 3 times telephoto lens, better than nothing, right? And finally, we have the Sony Xperia 1 Mark 7. Now, the telephoto lens on this phone actually performs more similar to a traditional camera. So it does zoom from 3.5 to 7.1 times through actual moving lenses. So everything in between is optical zoom. Right, at 3 times, they are still perfect in edge detection and bokeh rendering. They're like seeing each strand of my hair. Right, so at 3 times, other than the lack of a 3 times zoom lens on the iPhone, the rest of the competition we can see here, the edge detection and bokeh rendering is more or less on the same top tier level across the board, leaving the main difference to be the skin texture and skin color rendering. You'll be getting brighter skin, vivid colors on the Xiaomi, brighter skin, pale colors on the Sony, accurate and natural skin color on the Samsung and the iPhone, and skin smoothening effect up to a certain level on the Samsung, and nothing at all on the iPhone. Finally, we have long-range zoom, close-up portrait. On the Xiaomi, we have the 4.3 times zoom lens, which can be zoomed up to 6 times for portrait. The iPhone allows us to take portrait photos using its 5 times telephoto lens. Now, the 120mm 5 times telephoto lens on the S25 Ultra can also be used for portrait. And last but not least, we have 3.5 and 7.1 times on the Sony, which is 170mm. Here's the upgrade worth mentioning as well. Sony was still struggling with the portrait mode algorithm even in 2023, I would say. But here on the One Mark 7, not only is it taking perfect portrait photo for people, but also just like, I do really like this photo coming out of this phone. So I'm not going to go over again for the edge detection and the skin color effect. Instead, we are seeing brighter highlights on the Sony, so HDR is present on this phone, but in a more subtle way. I do think photos coming out of the Sony does look more natural, lively, and more camera-like. Combined with the creamy bokeh, smooth bokeh, and bokeh balls effect, it does look like a photo coming out of a camera. So that's about it for bokeh mode comparison during broad daylight on all the lenses. Now for low light photography and night portrait. We are seeing a slight difference in color temperature and color rendering on the Sony One Mark 7. So during the day, we have a cooler white balance and a greenish tint to its photo, while during the night we still have a cool white balance but reddish tint to its photo. So low light photography is generally looking more pleasing to the eyes on the Sony, I would say. Yet all other 3 phones nailed edge detection and bokeh rendering during the night. So 2025 is indeed the golden age for portrait photography, with next to none concern regarding the light condition. Alright, so the next part of this comparison would be landscape and zoom capabilities, just in case if you rarely or maybe never take portrait photos. So the first part being the ultra-wide-angle lens. On the Sony One Mark 7, again, it would be one of the biggest upgrades this year for the Sony phone, with a 1/1.56-inch flagship tier sensor, which is identical in size and resolution to the S25 main camera, not the Ultra. Here on the Samsung S25 Ultra, we also have a 50MP ultra-wide-angle lens, which is new to Samsung, and the quality was also the best I've tested before the Sony came into the market. Now, the Xiaomi 15 Ultra's got a 50MP as well ultra-wide-angle lens with a 1/2.76-inch sensor. And on the iPhone, we've also got a 48MP ultra-wide lens with a 1/2.55-inch sensor. Now, can you guess which phone took the sharpest image? It's on the ultra-wide-angle lens. As far as I can tell, the one on the second right is the sharpest, and is taken with the Xperia One Mark 7. So now the ultra-wide-angle lens on this phone is clearly sharper than the rest of the competition, not only in the center of the frame, but also the edges. The difference is way more obvious in the real world than I've anticipated, considering all 4 of them were exporting photos in 12MP. I didn't expect to see such an obvious gap between the Samsung and the Sony on the ultra-wide-angle lens, considering the S25 Ultra's already got one of the best ultra-wide lens on the market. I would say it is a huge bonus for a smartphone to take ultra-high-quality ultra-wide-angle lens photo. As I've said before, I do prefer the ultra-wide-angle lens over the selfie camera for selfie portrait and landscape. Oh, and I do take tons of landscape and city landscape photos when I'm traveling. Alright, for low light photography, now the large sensor on the Sony Xperia One Mark 7 could be delivering sharper and brighter images, but we'll see. In fact, the tendency for the Sony to keep the highlight slightly overexposed is quite different from all the rest of the manufacturers are doing today. As on the iPhone, the S25 Ultra and the Xiaomi, they all tend to suppress the highlights and try to bring the most details of the photo. I do agree on the Samsung, on the iPhone, and the Xiaomi, they do bring the most details on the highlights. But at the same time, you can really easily tell it's a photo coming out of a smartphone. While on the Sony, you can almost feel the light emitting from the light source from a photo. And in some cases, the ultra-wide-angle lens on the One Mark 7 does bring in more light and results in a brighter photo. Alright, so we're getting significant upgrade over the ultra-wide-angle lens and the portrait mode on the Sony. Now, the telephoto lens of this phone, on one hand, it is still a piece of engineering marvel, being able to optically zoom from 85mm to 170mm on one single lens on a smartphone. So it's basically doing the same thing, covering the same optical zoom range as the Samsung and the Xiaomi on one lens. But on the other hand, it's also a 12 megapixels 1/3.5-inch sensor. So the 100mm 200 megapixels telephoto lens on the Xiaomi and the 50 megapixels 120mm telephoto lens on the Samsung are going to be your choice if you do a lot of zooming. Now, this is quite interesting again. For 3 times zoom, the iPhone lacks a 70 or 80mm lens, so it's lagging behind in this area. While for 5 times zoom, all the phones are doing great using their long-range telephoto lens. Now, the Sony is doing a great job keeping up for 5 times zoom. So at 5 times, there's not much of a difference across the board. And at 3 times, the Sony is delivering top-notch texture and details, sometimes even higher than the S25 Ultra, considering the S25 Ultra is doing 10 megapixels at 3 times, while the iPhone is lacking a 3 times zoom lens again here. Alright, so this is 7.1 time or 170mm, just to check the quality of the maximum optical zoom range on the Sony. Now, at 7.1 times or 170mm, both the iPhone and the Samsung's using their long-range 5 times optical zoom lens, while on the Xiaomi is a 100mm 200 megapixels telephoto lens. Alright, the Sony is delivering the same amount of detail and sharpness as the Samsung and the iPhone at this range, while the Xiaomi is pulling slightly ahead. Alright, so for long-range telephoto photography, we can conclude the Sony is doing a decent, maybe even more than decent job at 3 times. At 3 times, I would say it's on a par with top-tier ultra flagship nowadays, while the iPhone's lacking a 70mm 3 times telephoto lens. At 5 times, the Sony is still doing great. The photos coming out of this phone is highly usable at this range, but you are seeing more details on the Samsung, especially the Xiaomi is leading in this competition. And at 10 times, I would say on the Sony Xperia 1 Mark 7, the maximum usable range would be around 10 times. Anything beyond that, the image is going to be a little bit softer, as you can expect. While on the Samsung, thanks to the 50 megapixels high-resolution tele lens and the 200 megapixels tele lens on the Xiaomi, they actually delivers just as sharp images at 20 times, while the Xiaomi 15 Ultra has a slight advantage on super long-range telephoto over the Samsung. So in the end, it may all comes to preference again. If you do prefer super long-range telephoto, especially anything beyond 10 times, over ultra-wide photography, I would recommend the Samsung and the Xiaomi. While if you do appreciate what Sony is doing this year by upgrading the ultra-wide-angle lens and preserving the camera-like color science, especially when it comes to controlling the highlights and the shadows, the Sony will be delivering more true-to-life and lively photos most of the time. You will be getting brighter highlights, higher contrast, and this very unique bluish-greenish tint to its photos, plus it's doing actually a decent job from 3.5 to 7.1 times zoom. Alright, for 4K 120 slow motion video, we've got main camera support on the iPhone. Now, the Xiaomi 15 Ultra can shoot 4K 120 on both the main camera lens and the telephoto lens as well. The S25 Ultra now can shoot 4K 120 on the main camera and the ultra wide-angle lens. So 4K 120 is another win for the Sony. It's basically got all 3 of its camera supporting 4K 120. The ultra wide, the main camera lens, and the telephoto lens. Now, when it comes to AI, Sony's AI is quite different from all the rest of the competition. We've seen the auto-framing feature and the AI camera work for its videography, but when it comes to AI summary, AI writing, translation and transcription, Sony seems to be ignoring all these. The good thing is, you can always rely on Google Gemini for this kind of stuff, which is available on this phone as well. So now, when it comes to photo editing, Sony doesn't even have their own album app. Again, the fortunate thing is we can always rely on Google Photo for similar stuff. And you're right, Magic Editor on Google Photos actually not bad at all. It's almost on a par with the Samsung. For this photo, we're trying to remove both of us, that we're sitting in the middle of a concert hall. I would say the texture and the level of detail on the Sony is on a par par with the S25 Ultra, which is slightly ahead of the Xiaomi, and the iPhone, they do need an upgrade. Now this scenario could be more practical. Now let's try to remove everyone except me myself. Now due to the complexity of the architecture, you do need advanced AI to remove the passerbys accurately. The positive argument for the iPhone is the AI is on device, so it's not connected to the cloud. Security, privacy is guaranteed. But you are getting a much better result on the Androids. Especially on the S25 Ultra, the AI actually rendered the reflection of a light on the ground on the marble. Similar image result is generated on the Sony using Google Photos. Alright, this photo will be pushing the limit on texture rendering, and you might be facing the same issue while on a holiday. The major difference we can see here is the iPhone is on-device AI, so the result is not going to compete with the Android phones, while the result we're getting from the Sony is shockingly similar to the one we're getting from the S25 Ultra. Right, for the last set of photo, we're trying to remove an object which is blocking my face as well. Now, if you're intending to remove objects or even people blocking your face, the S25 Ultra is constantly delivering the most accurate and compelling results, while I would say the Sony using Google Photos the close second. Xiaomi, it works, and it's the third. And finally, it comes to the iPhone. Maybe it's something to do with Apple's policy on security and privacy. The camera, check. AI features, check. The final bit of this video will be focusing on the processing power as well as the battery life on all these four phones. So we have the Apple in-house 3nm chip A18 Pro on the iPhone 16 Pro Max and Snapdragon 8 Elite on all these three Android phones, which is also a 3nm chip. The Geekbench test we have here is basically the peak performance on all these phones. In 2025, I would say it's not a major concern. So the second test we have here is the Wildlife Unlimited Stress Test, which is a 20 minutes high-load stress test. Now, heat dissipation used to be a weakness of a Sony phone, and I'm glad to show you this graph. This year, even the Sony phone, thanks to the mature TSMC 3nm technology, heat and efficiency is no longer an issue. Well, also thanks to the vapor chamber liquid cooling technology inside the One Mark 7. So we are looking at similar stability performance on all the S25 Ultra, iPhone 16 Pro Max and the One Mark 7. Slightly higher on the Xiaomi, but Xiaomi allows their phone to run slightly hotter as well. Alright, the battery. The Xiaomi 15 Ultra packs the largest battery, rated at 5410 mAh. Now both the S25 Ultra and the Sony Xperia 1 Mark 7 packs a 5000 mAh battery. So this is the results we got from our battery life test, which consists of 1 hour of YouTube video playback, 1 hour of Facebook scrolling similar to Instagram, and 1 hour of League of Legends Wild Rift gameplay at 50% screen brightness. Now if we estimate the battery life based on how fast the battery is draining on each of the phones, the S25 Ultra and the Xperia 1 Mark 7, which both packs a 5000 mAh battery, performed exactly the same, while the Xiaomi 15 Ultra is going to give you slightly longer screen on time, around 36 minutes more than Sony and the Samsung's going to give you. Alright, so it's the 7th year since Sony's launched their One Sony campaign, blending Sony's in-house Bravia TV technologies, their market-leading Walkman technologies, and the stronger-than-ever alpha camera technologies into one single piece of gadget, our smartphone. I do believe Sony holds all the cards. The true question I've got is, are they really committed to produce one single killer device, which will obviously dominate the smartphone market, but also probably competing with their own devices as well, namely the alpha cameras and the Walkman? But you know, in recent years, especially this year, I am convinced. I do get pretty good 3.5mm headphone listening experience, while on the go, it truly can replace a Walkman. While the camera, 4K 120 supports on all three of the cameras, the ultra-wide-angle lens and the upgraded bokeh mode, I can travel with only this phone right now, with a bright display and a large battery, and the powerful yet efficient Snapdragon 8 Elite chip. So this year, I can't really state an obvious weakness on this phone. If I really have to pick one, maybe even two, it would be super long-range telephoto, while Sony is doing exceptionally strong on ultra-wide-angle lens. Super long-range zoom is slightly lacking behind. And the screen-to-body ratio. I'm alright with it, but I'm not sure if every S25 Ultra, maybe even S24 Ultra user is going to be swapping to this phone.